Great. Thank you. Well, welcome everyone. And thanks for tuning into this LinkedIn Live conversation, next one in our series. So for the journalists who joined us today, this conversation is on the record. We'll also have opportunity. I'll try to, again, sift through questions as they come in. So please feel free to put those in the chat and we'll work those in as we move along. So just to tee up our topic today, the crackdown on greenwashing, why it matters, and managing your organization's risk. And certainly as we see products are labeled green or sustainable, there's been a rise in exaggerated, misleading, or unsubstantiated claims. And regulators who have a clear mandate to build trust in financial markets are taking notice. We've also seen the other side of the coin in some jurisdictions where anti-ESG sentiment is playing out as well. So we'll talk about greenhushing also. And at KPMG, we're supporting clients in identifying where the risks may lie in this challenging environment and the steps that companies should take to mitigate them. And that's what we'll discuss today. So if you've haven't joined one before, I'm Rob Fisher. I'm our US ESG leader in the US, and I'm joined by my partner and good friend, Maura Hodge, as always. But we've got a special friend today as well. We're super excited to have join us. So got Bridget Beals with us. So Bridget, maybe a quick intro from you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Rob. And good afternoon, everybody. So Bridget Beals, I'm a partner and the head of the climate risk and strategy team for KPMG in the UK. I've been working across the climate change and sustainability space for about 15 years now, across carbon markets, energy systems, and more broadly, bringing that together around some of that emerging regulation as that sort of push towards a low carbon world really starts to come to the fore. So great to be with you all.
Yeah, amazing to have you. Thanks for making time for us, Bridget. So I'm gonna go to Maura first. I'm gonna beat on her a little bit, and then we'll come back to you. So Maura, I got a few questions for you. Super hot topic right now. What is greenwashing? Just to level set us, like, why does it matter?
Yeah, Rob, well, you and I talk a lot about how ESG reporting should simply reflect what a company is doing to address their environmental, social, and governance risks and opportunities. But having worked in this space for a long time and, having just general interest in it for over 2 decades, I think what we've seen is that the topics that fall under that ESG umbrella tend to be really brand enhancing or reputational issues. So we've heard comments like, what's good for the planet is good for business, or we have to be good corporate citizens. We're trying to achieve a triple bottom line. And I think that there is definitely support, and those have been important to get us to where we are today. But I think going along with that, we've seen many companies kind of get caught up in making bold statements or commitments over the past 5, maybe 7 years. So you've all heard them, right? We'll be net zero by 2030, or we have green, sustainable, and socially conscious products. And they're really trying to appeal to that consumer base and, make themselves sound really great. But that's where greenwashing, I think, is coming in, and where we're really starting to shine a light on it. There are a lot of different definitions of greenwashing. I think there's a lot of confusion maybe around it. But, one way that could be defined is when an organization makes false, unsubstantiated, or outright misleading statements or claims about the sustainability of a product, service, or business operations more broadly. And so when you think about that, and you put that in the context of how we're thinking about greenwashing today, I think that there's a pretty big spectrum in terms of what greenwashing covers. It can range from dishonesty all the way to just wishful thinking. So am I outright lying and using dishonest practices in my business? I would say most companies don't, officially ascribe to doing that. But then you kind of move up in the chain and say, am I making marketing claims that really require a buyer to do their homework properly and interpret that claim? So we're saying something, but kind of the way it comes together is to put a sheen on it. Or do I have the best of intentions, but just don't have the actions to back up what I'm saying? Or do I actually think that I'm meeting my goals and commitments, but then don't have sufficient and accurate, reliable information to really support that? And so when we get to kind of that end of the spectrum, I've heard it called greenwishing. You'll hope that you'll meet your goals or commitments, but the reality is that you don't necessarily have the investments or the tangible actions in place to achieve the goal, or even the technologies don't exist for you to make the progress that you're hoping to make. And therefore, it may be a long shot for you to actually meet those goals. So I think greenwashing is actually a twofold problem. There's both the corporation side and the asset manager side. And I think on the corporation side, it's kind of a circular thought, right? That if corporations are saying something, asset managers are investing in those companies, or investors are investing in those companies based off of those claims, it creates an issue on both sides. So just as one quick example that I think maybe hopefully brings it to life is, let's take company in the consumer goods industry, and they have a claim that they're selling eco-friendly clothing, right? I think that that's pretty common. You see that on a lot of like tags and brands in the stores. But then you also have an asset manager that creates a fund and calls it green, and they invest in that company. Well, in many cases, neither firms really formally define what eco-friendly means, but yet they're marketing it as that. And so maybe that claim at the corporate level is just supported by the fact that they use organic cotton in all of their products. But they haven't taken into consideration that they also have leather taken from cows raised in the rainforest. They're still using virgin plastics for their polyester. They don't have any policies over chemical use in factories and their supply chain. They continue to use a lot of water despite, having their products manufactured in water-stressed areas. So both the consumers and asset managers are relying on that eco-friendly claim, but maybe don't fully understand what it means. And so I think that's, one of the big examples of greenwashing and kind of why it becomes a problem.
Yeah, and it's a really great example, I think, Maura, and it you can really see a number of reasons why businesses should be sensitive to greenwashing, but also like greenwishing, as you described it. And I think that could be sort of on the spectrum of getting close to greenwishing, probably, right? But how would you either way, there's a lot of risk there. What are sort of the main buckets of risk that you see clients face because of this?
So I would categorize them really into three areas. Number one, brand reputation. Two, litigation and regulation. And then three, your lost opportunity cost. I think brand reputation is pretty clear and obvious, and probably came out in the last example that I gave. But litigation and regulation, which I think we're all feeling, and Bridget will talk a little bit more about what we're seeing in the UK that impacts us all. In the US, the SEC has proposed new rules about the naming of funds, as well as disclosures around investments in ESG type funds. We have the SEC Enforcement Division really looking at companies, what they're saying around their green or sustainable practices around climate change. We've seen some settlements come out of that work and from that division already. So there's clearly increased scrutiny there. And then we're also seeing lost opportunity cost. It could be, within the cost of capital or access to capital, which we talk a lot about investors, but we're seeing it both in the debt and equity markets. And we're also seeing it from suppliers and companies. The federal government is now asking for disclosures on companies' reductions in carbon emissions and their greenhouse gases. We're expecting it to come from European regulations to be required to disclose, that you've set a science-based target. And so there's clearly a lot of risk to business if we don't get this right.
Yeah, so I think you've covered it pretty well. Right? Greenwashing, clearly a significant impact. But this whole area of ESG more broadly is becoming, particularly here in the U.S., but in other jurisdictions too, more politicized. What is some of the driving activity you see that's causing companies to flip maybe to the other side of the coin, and they're not going to say anything at all? Like, what's going on there?
Yeah. Well, I think, you can throw green in front of any word, but we're calling this greenhushing, or I've heard it called greenhushing. So this idea that a company is just going to refuse to talk about their impact on the climate, or even the activities and the actions that they're taking, because they're afraid of being criticized or, getting caught up in the political sandstorm. But I think that it's a failing strategy to say nothing. Fair disclosure is really vital to successful capital markets. And we know that at a minimum, climate change is being factored into decision-making across the board. So I think that we're also seeing that the SEC believes that, because the proposed rules make both greenhushing and greenwashing more difficult, because what they're pushing for is more rigorous and comparable and transparent information around what companies are doing. And the last thing that I would say around it is just, let's move away from the umbrella term ESG and really talk about those specific actions, activities, topics, issues that are material to your business, and talk about them in those terms. So, is it about hiring practices? Is it about how we're addressing the risk of climate change on our business? Let's start getting a little bit more focused instead of kind of that blanket look. And I think that we can make a lot of progress that way.
That's great. Thank you. So Bridget, let me bring you in now, because certainly I think Europe has really kind of led the charge in terms of regulators across those jurisdictions seeking to protect financial markets against the potential damage of greenwashing, right? So, and sort of at the forefront of that is the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, or SFDR, that seeks, one aspect of it certainly is to try to address some of that greenwashing concern. Could you maybe just give us a little sort of background on SFDR and some perspectives on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And Maura used two words which I think are really, really important, which was transparency and comparability. And a lot of what's happening across Europe at the moment is really coming back to how we deliver on those two kind of key ambitions. ESG, or sustainability, kind of disclosure more broadly, something that's probably been embraced across Europe, going back kind of best part of a decade. But all these standards have emerged in such a different way and frame, that what we're really now driving towards is that standardization, that transparency, and that comparability for users of that information as we go forward. And the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, or SFDR as it's more commonly known, is a framework that's really there to help the financial markets start to put that kind of product comparability in place to reduce that noise between is it an energy transition, a climate fund, an impact fund? Do they mean the same thing? And are the outcomes derived from those different funds fundamentally comparable? And basically the SFDR is a classification mechanism. So when funds are launched, they can be classified as Article 6, Article 8, Article 9. And that really determines, is it a standard fund? Is it a light green fund? Or is it indeed, a dark green fund? And that just really helps people to deliver into those categories in a much more transparent and robust way. Specifically when it comes to kind of that fund designation. So is it Article 8 or Article 9? Fund managers really need to be able to provide information that underpins that classification, and really starts to provide information about the impacts of their investment on society and the planet. And they do that around what's known as the principal adverse impact indicators. And those are things that are starting to kind of move over time. So the SFDR is intended to really raise the bar for investment products, but as they do that, as those investment managers start to ask for more information in order to fulfill those requirements, then there is a trickle-down effect into those public and private markets into which that investment is flowing as well. So really a kind of a double-edged sword in terms of the impact of that comparability and that transparency of the data. And one thing I think is really important just to note, Rob, is as we think about that legislation is, whilst it's a European regulation, that also applies to anyone who's marketing funds into Europe as well. So we do expect that, what we're already seeing, that's having a trickle-down effect across the globe in terms of, how that's applied and how that's taking place in terms of some of the market opportunity as well.
Yeah, so thanks for that, Bridget. I appreciate it. We actually also got a question in chat. This may be unfair, and so if you need to defer and we can follow up, that's fine too. But someone asked about the European directive on green claims and whether that applies for services or only for consumer products. So I guess that's more on the corporate side, but do you have any sort of initial perspective on that?
I'm not an expert in that specific regulation, Rob, but certainly, In addition to that SFDR, we are seeing some of the regulators across Europe and the UK really tackle that greenwashing issue head on. So here in the UK, we are seeing the FCA, the Competition and Markets Authority, all those different regulators start to launch consultations that help protect consumers to those same challenges that Maura was talking about in terms of, is it eco-friendly, is it carbon neutral? Is that claim really substantiated? And can you even use some of those terms anymore? So that is definitely the direction of travel around European regulation, and it's something that both consumers, producers, and fund managers really need to be careful about in terms of how they substantiate the claims that they're making as they go forward.
That's great. So if I was going to say, if I bring you a little closer to home, but as we talked about, as a very proud New Zealander, I can't call UK your home, merely where you live currently. But in your current place where you live, what steps are you seeing in the UK as well to lessen greenwashing?
Yeah, so in addition to those kind of direct attacks on greenwashing that I just spoke about, we also have our own kind of broader corporate disclosure regime here in the UK, which is called the Sustainability Disclosure Requirement, the SDR, and that's a package of reforms. And it's one of those things where I think reading the whole is actually much greater than the sum of the parts, even though I'm sure many people who are faced with that those requirements think the individual parts are reasonably sort of high hurdles anyway. But under that SDR, we have the UK's green taxonomy, which is under consultation at the moment, but likely to be substantially similar to the EU taxonomy. So again, a labelling regime. What's really important there is that that's starting to unlock this definition of an in-transition asset as well. So applying right at that fund level, but crucially from a corporate lens, starting to really look into how much revenue is starting to be derived from green products, how much capex is actually being spent on delivering on the commitments that you've made, and making sure that those claims are not just baseless ambitions, but there's a real trajectory of change in order to meet those. We have the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or the TCFD, which is quite similar to the SEC rule in terms of the substance. Obviously, the application is slightly different. Now, that applies to all premium listed companies in the UK. And then we have a broader rule, which is called the CFD, which is regulated in the UK for 1,300 private companies as well. So those largest private companies. And of course, that requires companies to start to understand the risks and the opportunities of the big sort of change that would occur, either as we see the effects of the potential global warming in our physical environment, or indeed in the economic environment from that transition to a low carbon world. And then, subject to consultation, we'd start to see potentially that TCFD wrapped up into the International Sustainability Standards Board. Now, the International Sustainability Standards Board, or the ISSB, are starting with climate, which is why I say sort of wrapping up that TCFD. But they've been really, really clear, and it's out for consultation at the moment, that framework would start to move into nature as well, into other sustainability issues, potentially things like nature as well as we move forward. And then the final thing, which I think is important as part of that package of reforms, is around the transition plan requirement. Now, the UK's launched what they call the UK Transition Plan Task Force. And late last year at COP27, they actually launched their gold standard guidance for transition plans, and very much with an ambition that would become a global standard. Throughout 2023, they're putting in place a range of sector guidance to really drive that transparency and that comparability in forward-looking analysis of how a company is seeking to deliver on their transition plan. So really unpacking across those short, medium, and long-term targets that a company has set out, What are the tangible actions that they're taking? How will those manifest in actual change? And how is a company actually starting to embrace those operational levers, things like internal carbon pricing, links to remuneration, which would actually start to demonstrate that a company is actually putting into place the stepping stones for change and not just free riding on that net zero 2050 kind of or 2030 claim that they may have put into the marketplace.
Yeah, so Bridget, I think we use a lot of acronyms, but man, you've added a whole bunch more for us today between the EU and the UK, like so many different things to worry about. So, I mean, it's pretty daunting for a company, that's global in nature, has to worry about the requirements in all the different jurisdictions around the world. Like, so what would be your kind of practical, okay, there's 8 million regulations out there, but how do I go about at a holistic level avoiding greenwashing and greenwishing when I'm communicating my environmental efforts and my commitments to the public?
Yeah, and I think there's probably two key pieces of advice that I'd give anybody who wants to avoid this. The first is really around governance, and this is making sure that you have the right tone from the top. Making sure that your board, your CEO, are actually really behind the delivery of the plans, the ambitions, and the statements that you've set out, and make sure that the steer is clear from the top of the house that this is an ambition and a statement that matters alongside financial profitability, but should be considered as a really clear strategic intent of the business, not just something we've said that we don't really care about and should definitely be secondary to financial profitability. So tone at the top is absolutely number one. And then the second thing for me is this sort of transition that we're on now. This is really the second wave for me of sustainability. We had sustainability version 1, which is where we did corporate social responsibility, and sustainability really sat outside on a limb at the side of the business. We are way beyond that now, and sustainability, climate change, ESG, whatever you want to call it, it really needs to be integrated into core business strategy, as Maura said right at the outset. If we're integrating it into core business strategy, so it's part of capital planning, it's part of investment planning, it's part of remuneration, and it's part of core business strategy, then almost the disclosure sort of falls out the other end because the business is already operationalizing this in the right way. And to me, that's the second thing, which is absolutely critical to avoiding greenwashing and delivering on those great ambitions that I know companies are really standing behind.
Yeah, and I really like that. I haven't heard kind of that version 2.0 of sustainability, but that really resonates with me. So I love that. We've had some great questions come in, and some more. Maybe I'm gonna. There's one here that talks about, will we see more sustainable products emerging in Europe where the thresholds are lower under, I'm not sure, it seems backward, low under SFDR, and how can companies, sorry, now this thing is scrolling on me at the same time, bear with me, and how can investors compare products fairly that are sustainable in one jurisdiction but don't meet any of the thresholds under SFDR?
I think what's really important to remember is that when it comes to defining sustainable or eco-friendly, it's a bit in the eye of the beholder, right? We're all over the board in terms of what is important to us as consumers, I think, and acknowledging that there are probably trade-offs in any decision that's made. And so I don't know that I can answer the question directly, but I think having that in the back of your mind, what's most important is that you draw your line in the sand, and as an organization, you are defining what that means for yourself. And then whether if you get sort of the gold star, that sticker, right, that says it's in compliance with the SDR levels, or if you're become a certified B Corp or certified organic, there's all these other things out there that you can kind of add to enhance that brand and that reputation. But I think it's healthy, right, to have that debate over where that line is and what's appropriate. And so there is a piece of it where investors need to make that decision for themselves and figure out what that cutoff is. But the key then is transparency and disclosing what decision you've actually made.
Yeah, agreed. So I'm just looking through some of the other questions here. There was one around what are the possible consequences? Like, are we going to see headlines like what just happened? In GDPR, there was a pretty high profile fine in that regard. But will we see same things in greenwashing? I would just say Google the words greenwashing and fines, and we're already there. That's already happening. I won't go into any specifics, but you can read for yourself a number of articles, and you'll see different regulatory jurisdictions are really starting to pick up on that now. I think there was another one more. This is probably a good one for you as well. With respect to the SEC, the ISSB, and the CSRD, is there expectation that convergence of these rules will happen anytime soon? And if not, what will the differences between those rules, be in terms of implications for greenwashing, wishing, and hushing?
It's a really great question. So I think what we have to remember is that really the primary overlap of all of those rules right now is only around climate, right? So we only have sort of explicit standards that are at a level of detail that you can really analyze and understand how it might impact your ultimate metric disclosures and what your numbers are and those types of things. I think a lot of the qualitative disclosures have nuance, but generally go back to the same thing. So what are the risks? What are your opportunities? What's your strategy? What are your metrics that you're monitoring and your targets that you're setting and the governance you have around it? Hence TCFD is sort of that baseline. But where I think the real uniqueness comes out then is as you're actually calculating out specific metrics. So one major difference between the standards right now is your boundaries. So what's in and what's out, and how much scope 3 gets disclosed versus not. And so I do think that could create some confusion in the marketplace if we don't get to a point where we can actually understand how the differences between the standards, impact what the overall results are. And I think ideally, I do know that all the standard setters are working behind the scenes to try to get to that convergence. But I think once it's all implemented, then it's just sort of a question of, do we need reconciliations between the two to show where those differences are, or if it could be sort of backed into based off of the disclosure, similar to like financial reporting between IFRS and US GAAP.
Yeah. Bridget, anything you would add there? Like, how you seeing that play out? I mean, you've got some TCFD reporting requirements in the UK, and you've got CSRD, how is that playing out in real time from your perspective?
Yeah, and I think we're getting that question all the time, Rob. I think at the core of it, there's lots of differences, exactly as Maura says, but there's also a huge amount of commonality in terms of the strategic business change that these regulations are trying to drive. And one of the things we've done at KPMG is actually mapped all of the requirements across these global regulations. You can imagine there's thousands and thousands of lines of data. But actually, when you boil it back, there's about 200 different metrics that you would need to report if you were reporting on everything around the world. Don't worry, everybody, it's not for everyone, all of it. But there'd be 200 metrics. And so what we're working with companies to do is actually, how do you solve for those 200 metrics or part thereof, rather than worrying about each individual sort of piece of disclosure that you're obligated to, and then work out how to, once that's created, how to section that out in order to actually report it. And that really brings it back to the strategic change, because my worry is that companies spend so long worrying about the reporting regulations that they don't actually focus on the change that they need to make to deliver on their ambitions, which of course, is really at the heart of all of this in terms of, where we're trying to get to.
Yeah, so you're worried that we're going to have complete and accurate reporting of horrible progress against
exactly.
Got it. Yeah. Well, let me Maura, maybe I'll ask you one last question and kind of give you the last word, for the day for this webcast. So, how do CEOs communicate their ESG performance amongst all of this when there's often this this skepticism, if you will, around greenwashing. I'll let you close there.
Yeah. I mean, the concept of greenwashing, really, the heart of it is that there's mistrust, right? There's mistrust around ESG performance. There's mistrust about the statements and the information that's out there. And I think that actually kind of aligns to where we are as society today. I was just reviewing the 2021 Edelman Trust Barometer because, I think this comes up kind of in all parts of the world, but a couple of stats that stood out to me. 86% of US investors believe that companies frequently overstate or exaggerate their ESG progress when disclosing their results, and a vast majority doubt that commitments will be made. 87% of institutional investors anticipate more litigation. We talked about that as a result of companies not delivering on ESG promises. And then they've repeatedly found that business is the most trusted institution. But when we bring that greenwashing lens over it, I think negative publicity due to greenwashing could really erode that trust. So if I had to give you any takeaways or, the 3 key actions that you can think about and work on, number one, it's so important to go out and understand what you've even put out in the public already. What are the ESG commitments, targets, claims? It's amazing sometimes when you maybe not having been close to this information previously, go out and read your sustainability report and realize how many big statements are made out there, right? So going through those, understanding if they're actually defined, actionable, if you're making progress as an organization to date. And if you're not, it's really important to start to take steps to address it. And one of the big things we're talking to clients about right now is actually thinking about what investment is required. So do your current budgets and forecasts actually have these actions built into them in order to be able to meet your goals? The second area that's really important, and I think a lot of our clients have started to catch on to this already, but don't make new ESG commitments or set new targets until you have that infrastructure in place. So many companies are already out there. They've made all of these statements. We got to go back and clean it up. But anything new really needs to have an appropriate approval process, have cross-functional input from operations, legal, finance, and make sure that you're taking all the risks into consideration. And then lastly, start taking credit for the things that you're doing. If you're still early on in your journey, you haven't reported anything, can look around. There's probably a lot of things that fall under the ESG umbrella that you're doing. So start to collate those, but then before you put it out publicly, make sure that what you're saying is material to stakeholders and that you can back it up if you should ever get a question around it. So in the end, taking away those 3 action points, I would really sum it up by saying you got to walk your talk and talk your walk. It goes both ways, but I think that's one way to really combat greenwashing.
It's a perfect way to close, Maura. I appreciate it. So thanks everyone for joining. Bridget, special thanks to you for making time for us from over the pond today. And we look forward to seeing folks on a future LinkedIn Live, and you know where to find each of us on LinkedIn anytime if you'd like to connect. So thanks and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.